Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
Thank you. I know that there is great excitement today. More grace is to be bestowed upon our young people and ultimately upon our lives. I just, for a variety of reasons, yesterday sat down and asked myself, I wonder how many times I've actually received communion in my life. So I would say I go to church. I've been to church every day for the last 15 years, but I would say even the 3 years before that was probably most days. But if we just simply go for the last 15 years, that would be a little over 3,000 times I've received communion. So probably total, it's probably close to like 4,000 times my whole life. And I remember my first communion. I don't remember my second communion. And I would say I probably don't remember most of my communions because it can kind of just get caught up in life. But every time we receive communion really ought to be a total game changer. Right? It really ought to have a deep impact in our life. So I began to think to myself, well, is there some saints or blessed that show what simply receiving communion really can do for people? And so I want to just talk about a few different saints, and one's actually a blessed today for Holy Communion. Probably certainly the historically most famous of all the saints is a child actually of just a few years old. This is Saint Tarcisius. Saint Tarcisius was a Roman boy in the early parts of the church, and he was one of the very few young people who actually converted. Boys and girls, can you see this? I know that. Okay. Saint Tarcisius was a young boy in the early Christian community. Now, we think of the Christian community much like we think of just our own experience. The church was not legalized until after Saint Tarcisius died. So Saint Tarcisius was a young Roman boy, and in order to get communion to those people who were imprisoned, they wouldn't let priests go in there, and they certainly wouldn't let adults go in there. So Saint Tarcisius stepped forward and said, I'll take communion to them. And so this little boy was then bringing communion into the prison to those who otherwise wouldn't be able to receive communion. Again, in this time period, it was illegal to be Christian, and if the state found out that you were Christian, you'd be penalized. Imagine living in a culture where, let's just crazily say, the president could use the FBI to seek out Christians. Be totally nonsense, wouldn't it? Anyway, so they looked for this boy, and they eventually found him. And it was actually a group of young boys that found him, and they unfortunately beat him up. And because he wanted to protect the Eucharist that he was carrying, he placed it close to his chest, and he died tragically. But when they rolled him over, they couldn't find the host. So that host in the center there, they think that happened, that his chest consumed the host that he had. Right, so this is one of our earliest of saints in the church, Saint Tarcisius, who lived a truly heroic life. I began to wonder myself, are there more? Let's jump forward several hundred years. This is Saint Jose Sanchez del Rio. I didn't realize it till just a few minutes ago. Both of these actually deal with governments that were reacting against Christians. Saint Jose Sanchez del Rio was a young boy in Mexico in the early 1900s when the Mexican government decided that it was going to try to root out all Christianity, especially Catholics. And so they began a war with Catholics. So if you ever heard the Cristeros, that's what he was a part of, Saint Jose Sanchez del Rio. And he was deeply convicted after learning how to serve Mass and receiving his first Holy Communion. And so he joined the war, but the general wouldn't let him fight. So his job was to help the priest, both with Mass, but also move from place to place. The Mexican government eventually captured St. Jose Sanchez del Rio, and they wanted to break the whole movement. And so they wounded St. Jose Sanchez del Rio's feet, and they made him walk through the town so the whole town could see this young boy in pain. And they told him, all you have to do is just renounce your faith. All you have to do is renounce your faith, and you can live. And he stood very boldly with his arms out like he was hanging on the cross, and he screamed out, "Vivo Cristo Rey," which means long live Christ the King. And he died. And because of this one little boy, he's actually 14 years old, this one boy, all of Mexico rose up against its repressive government, and Mexico is known as a Christian country. It might not be doing very well in its Christian identity right now, but in 1928, it became very Catholic in that country because of one child who was convicted after receiving Holy Communion. Let's just talk about one more. There's actually a more recent one. These are all older people. This one's actually not a saint yet. This is Blessed Carlo Acutis. Can you see that over there? This is Carlo Acutis. Carlo Acutis actually just passed away in 2006. Carlo was born in 1991, so he's actually younger than I am. A little older than you all, but younger than I am. He came from a family that was not practicing their faith. He came from a family that didn't really believe. And he received his first Holy Communion, and he wrote in his diary that it deeply impacted his life. He had to change his entire life because of simply one time receiving communion. And so he actually had computer skills. He knew the internet very well. I don't know the internet at all, but he knew the internet very well. So he founded a website for all the Eucharistic miracles. So all throughout the history of the church, there's been times where what looks like bread and tastes like bread takes on the appearance of flesh and it begins to bleed. He began to categorize those occurrences throughout history. He also liked to play video games. He also liked to wear Nike shoes. He's known as the Blessed with Nikes on. In his tomb, he's got Nike shoes on with like a running jacket on. So he's not dressed like saints when we think of him. This is just a few years ago. He received communion just simply one time, and it deeply impacted his life. Tragically, in 2006, he found out that he had leukemia, and just 7 days later, he died. And in those 7 days, he prayed very fervently for the conversion of all sinners, for a deeper faith in the true presence of the Eucharist, and he offered his suffering for the Pope. This is a child. He was 15 years old when that happened. Boys and girls, people say to you all the time, well, when you get older, you can do those things. When you become an adult, you can do those things. We have several examples here of children who are unwilling to wait to live heroic lives. Most of them, their families also were not necessarily very faithful. And they lived so heroically, especially Carlo Acutis, his entire family converted because of a child. I have a favorite line that Carlo would use all the time, and it's very simple. He says, people are born as originals, but many die as photocopies. In the church in 2023, we see a lot of people kind of just doing the same thing they see everyone else doing. We don't need any more photocopies. We need true originals. Let your first communion be deeply impactful. Everyone else, whatever number of communion this might be for you, let it be deeply impactful. Because we do have a lot of photocopies right now. But we need true originals. God's not asking for more of one person, but for you to live the life that He's calling you to live. Don't die allowing everyone to say, yeah, he or she was just like everybody else.